So I just watched the Amazing Atheist video, "What is God?" and then I watched Fred's response that, well, perhaps God is in the brain. Um, and I want to post this to Fred because I think I would have a more interesting conversation with Fred if he chooses to respond. Um, I think the Amazing Atheist was describing his image of um, a theist and really describing his own projection, the sort of thing, the sort of person that Hugh is wanting to define himself in opposition to. He's not actually talking about the majority of religious practitioners as they exist and the diversity of ways that they do in our society in America and across the world. Um, because what the Amazing Atheist was basically doing, to sum up his video, is saying that religion is a result of lazy thinking, of intellectual ineptitude, uh, and I think that's a mistake. Um, thinking, thinking rationally, thinking scientifically, thinking in a philosophically deep way does not necessarily lead you um, away from God. And that's an empirical statement just based on uh, a historical survey of the history of human thought. There have been plenty of geniuses who were in some form spiritual or religious. Um, there are plenty of smart people who are atheists as well. And at the end of the day, it comes down to how we're going to define our terms in a network of um, meaningful context, and how we understand God, how we employ the term God can differ. And the sort of theistic worldview that the Amazing Atheist was criticizing, I think, was rightly criticized, but it's not, I don't think, at least in my experience, it's not typical of the, in general, religious perspective. Um, God is not always a God of the gaps. God is not always used to explain those things that can't otherwise be explained. Because really, I would say that God is a word worth talking about. I think even Fred, ConferenceReport, does, but for a different reason. I think it's worth talking about, because I make a sort of distinction between what can count as evidence for God, between a sort of ontic evidence and an ontological evidence. Um, that there is anything is evidence of God to me. Now, as far as what there is, the many finite things that exist within the sphere of nature, God cannot offer much explanation there. God may be necessary to any explanation of what there is, and I think God is necessary because God explains that why there should be anything and that there is anything at all. Um, we could never have an empirical answer to the question of why there is anything at all. Science tries to answer this question with a sort of multiverse theory where our universe is one of an infinite number of random assortments of emergences, cosmic emergences from the quantum vacuum, and that it just so happened that this one was as fine-tuned as ours so as to produce stable elements, stars, planets, and life, and intelligent life capable of understanding the whole process. Um, so God is an intuition of the infinite, not an explanation of the finite. And I think rather than try to explain God as a sort of spark in the brain created by this, evolutionarily primitive region, the brainstem, as Fred was explaining, that Antonio Damasio, the neuroscientist, is approaching this from. I think we can take a sort of Whiteheadian approach, a pan-experientialist approach, where interiority is a property of matter. This matter is not a substance, it's a process, and part of being or becoming as a process is experiencing. And so rather than God being the sort of external explanation for the universe, God is immanent, and the explanatory power of God is not in terms of design, but in terms of experience, in terms of the aesthetic experience of order and of beauty and of novelty. God is evident in these things, which are not, particular finite things, but really harmony is something that even science depends upon for its pursuit of universal physical laws. If there were not harmony, there would be no universal physical laws. So the sort of aesthetic experience of beauty is a presupposition, in that this aesthetic experience reveals the harmonious nature of the universe to us, is a sort of epistemic presupposition to the scientific method, for the scientific method. And, I think the way Whitehead talks about perception, I think is important. The Amazing Atheist asked this question. He said, without God, would your perception of the world collapse? And I think in the sense that Whitehead intended God to be employed in our discourse, perception would collapse without God, because God participates in perception, right? Specifically for Whitehead, God provides the initial aim for each of our perceptual moments, the initial teleological aim. God values certain future actualities more than others, and tries to persuade our experience in that direction. We don't necessarily have to choose that direction, because we are our own actual occasion, capable of valuing with some degree of freedom, of course always in relation to inheritance of an ancient series of past occasions. But even so, we have some degree of freedom to value God's initial aim, or to waver, to err, to wander. But our perception of an ordered world is deeper than just sort of this, what streams in through the senses. Whitehead talked about sensory experience as it's normally understood, and bodily experience, or bodily perception. And for Whitehead, bodily perception is primary, and it's not really the brain stem in particular where a spark of consciousness suddenly emerged. It's rather the entire organism. Whitehead would say that a single cell possesses sentience. He wouldn't say that an atom possesses sentience, but an atom would possess, it would be a society of actual occasions, and actual occasions are drops of experience. And so an atom, as a self-organizing system, has some sort of experience. It's not sentient, because sentience seems to me to imply an ability to respond to an environment, where an atom, depending on the number of electrons in its outer shell, does respond to an environment in some simplistic way. It's very repetitive, repetitive even beyond the point of insight.